Welcome students. My name is Sabine Schlacke. I'm a professor of public law and I specialized in environmental law. I teach at the University of Bremen. I am the director of the Research Center for European Environmental Law at the University of Bremen in Germany. Today I will present lecture 7 of our e-learning presentation, A New Statehood Within the Multi-Level System. Basically, we will deal with chapter 5 of the Global Change Council's flagship report, World in Transition, A Social Contract for Sustainability. In the first episode, we will deal with the role of the proactive state. The second episode will address the role of the European Union. And then we will conclude with the third episode with an interview. What are our learning outcomes? First of all, you will understand what the proactive state and its functions are about. Secondly, you will understand the policy mix necessary for the transformation. And then, thirdly, I will give you an overview of the impediments and barriers of the transformation. After that, I hope you will know more about the approaches and their proposals to overcome these impediments. And finally, you will be able to describe the transformation potentials in Brazil, China, and India. These learning outcomes also structure our lecture. Firstly, I will explain what the proactive state is about. Then, secondly, we will take a look at the policy mix of the proactive state for the transformation. Thirdly, we will discuss impediments and barriers I mentioned already. And then we will debate the approaches to overcome these impediments. After that, I will give you some examples of newly industrializing countries like China, Brazil, and India. And after that, I will sum up our in a conclusion. Let me start with a historical approach to explaining what the proactive state is about. In the 1970s, we realized that there was increasing bureaucracy and rising public spending in the Western world. As a reaction to this, in the 1980s and the 1990s, the state stepped back. Many public affairs were now organized and managed by private enterprises in areas like urban water supply or the urban energy supply. An extensive denationalization and deregulation took place. At the same time, many OECD states' resources for fiscal intervention diminished whilst average public spending did not decrease. States have been perceived as both powerless and overpowering. The disadvantages of deregulated market mechanisms become particularly apparent with respect to environmental quality. Companies in free markets are not able to consider the long-term dimensions of their business models. They often do not take into account the consequences of their actions for and in the environment. In respect to health, safety, and protection of the environment, technology applications makes environmental regulation on the part of the state inevitable. but privatization of many public tasks in the public interest made it difficult to regulate and control the private sector. The global economic and financial crisis demonstrates as a culminating point the failure of the deregulated market mechanisms and the absence of the state in an important sector of public welfare. The Global Change Council therefore encourages the states to change their attitude. Instead of being a moderating state, states should become a proactive state and pursue a proactive transformation policy itself. That means that the state has to act and not to stay stable. In the opinion of the Advisory Council, the present situation requires states to return to playing a more active role. The state has to set up a regulatory framework for the transformation which is needed. The state has to support the financing of the transition of technology. And the state has to mobilize civil society to take part at the transformation. That's the key element of the transformation which we propose, we want to bring on their way, its way. The model of our proactive state is a liberal and constitutional democracy. For a democratic state, under the rule of law, basic obligations continue to apply, for example, human rights or constitutional procedural law. We understand democracy in a wide sense. The state's legitimacy is not only justified by votes, but also by the acceptance of the civil society. This acceptance can only be achieved by a widespread participation of the civil society in policy and decision-making. The task of the world's states for the next 40 years is not to pass the planetary boundaries, especially not to exceed the 2 degrees Celsius planetary boundary for our climate. In our opinion, climate protection is not a restriction or an unreasonable deprivation. Climate protection is a task and at the same time a chance for a proactive state. The proactive state has the explicit task of preserving available choices and the living standards for future generations. The state has to define these living standards and to change the current living standards. Climate protection is also a chance. The proactive state must promote the innovations necessary for the transformation, mobilize the actors important for this process, and remove barriers. These are 3 key elements of the acting of the state we have in our mind. One of the central components of such a proactive state is regulation that encourages innovations. Later, we deal with different ways the state could encourage innovation. However, the increase in state governance resultant from regulations does not automatically mean less market or fewer private innovations, or fewer private initiatives. On the contrary, state action should be aimed at using and supporting market forces and civil society commitment for the purpose of the transformation. The increase in state interventions must be offset by an increase of citizen involvement. However, a proactive state open to innovation must also not push innovations through at any cost. If there is, for example, no acceptance by the civil society, the proactive state has to reflect and rethink its initiative. The constitutional obligations of the state continue to apply above all the basic rights. Constitutional procedural law and the establishment of national objectives to take environmental protection into account, all these regulations still have to be established and have to be on the roadmap. Now I will come to the policy mix for the transformation. A proactive state has to correct various forms of market failure, for example, positive and negative external effects, public goods, information asymmetries, market entry barriers, and natural monopolies. Therefore, a proactive state has to use a portfolio of measures. There are a lot of studies concerning this portfolio in special sectors, for example, the energy sector. We did a lot of research and we read a lot of studies. And now I will come to the positive message. We could conclude that the required instruments are already known and mostly available, especially the political, economic, and legal instruments, such as administrative command and control, taxation, tradable permits, market regulation, or regional and urban planning, needed to correct the present market failure and to manage the transformation, are known and available. That is the positive message. The negative message is that these policy mixes are not yet focused on the required transformation. For a transformative effect on production and consumption, the simultaneous use of various instruments is required for a policy mix to initiate systemic and fundamental changes in the economy and society. The design of a transformation policy should trigger fast and long-term oriented structural changes, avoid path dependencies, and help to overcome present obstructive short-term orientations. The policy mix for the transformation should concentrate primarily on the following three areas. Firstly, it should support the development of new markets for innovations. Innovation could be supported by efficiency and production standards, public support for research and development, public demonstrations or staging of competitions. Secondly, it should provide incentives for climate-friendly market behavior. For example, with production standards, bioenergy quotas, CO2 tax, CO2 emission permits, or information campaigns. And thirdly, it should target the supply of public goods. For example, regional infrastructural planning certifications, payment for ecosystem services, where farmers are rewarded for soil formations or water cycle regulation, or labeling. After that overview of the policy mix, let me now explain the role and the function of some instruments more deeply. And I will start with the carbon pricing, because the carbon pricing, in our view, is a necessary political measure for the transformation. I would like to introduce you to its advantages and how it could be implemented. Carbon pricing means to take a market price for CO2 emissions. Carbon pricing can systematically guide production, consumption, and investment decisions towards low carbon and accelerate the decarbonization of energy systems, as well as climate-friendly urbanization and land use. On the one hand, CO2 pricing increases the incentives on the supplier side to expand renewable energies and increasingly use low-emission production technologies. Moreover, a high CO2 price is a prerequisite for the earning power of many investments in low-emission technologies. It accelerates the substitution of fossil with renewable energy sources, for example, which also leads to learning effects and cost reductions. On the other hand, it causes changes on the demand side. A high CO2 price thus leads to rising energy and product prices, thereby reducing energy consumption and the consumption of goods which are carbon intensive. This stimulates an increased tapping of energy efficiency potentials. Now I like to discuss some different possibilities to implement carbon pricing. For example, you can implement carbon pricing with a quantity control, which means restricting the emissions from fossil sources with a CO2 tax, or it can be implemented by introducing tradable emission rights and establishing a CO2 emission trading system. Tradable rights are preferable to a CO2 tax because the tax can achieve the desired emissions reduction only in a trial and error process through tax adjustment. Another advantage is that only one marketplace for trading rather than a fiscal authority to collect and redistribute the tax needs to be established. A political advantage of emission trading is the option of allocating emission rights on the basis of a politically negotiated distribution key. Financial transfer could be generated much more reliable through tradable emission rights as a fraction of a global emission budget. The German Advisory Council proposes the following steps with progressive ambition levels. Firstly, for the EU region, the EU emission trading scheme should be refined and a G20 agreement on carbon pricing should be reached. Secondly, the linking of current ETS should be pursued. The more countries that join a linked system, the higher the chances that other countries will follow their example. And thirdly, we propose an ETS that is as global as possible, with joint restrictions that should be established. The speedy and comprehensive integration of the major high-emission countries in a global ETS would ensure that significant global emissions reductions can be achieved. In those countries where the requisite administrative structures and institutions, such as legal security, are not in place, a national CO2 tax may prove to be the more appropriate instrument. Let me give you now a short summary. We have seen that we know most instruments of the policy mix which are needed for a transformation. The positive message. These instruments are already partly implemented. Also a positive message. We realize also a worldwide awareness of Earth system crisis tendencies. We have discussed these problems for more than 20 years at various international conferences. And we must conclude that all these efforts have so far yielded only limited success. And now we have to ask, what are the impediments and barriers for the transformation we discuss in our flagship report? In other words, what are the barriers for a transformation towards sustainability? The German Advisory Council on Global Change has so far identified 4 primary factors which hamper the transformation. Firstly, politics in democracies focus on a short parliamentary term and the current constraints of staying in power. This is coupled with delaying methods of handling dissent and finding compromises in political negotiation arenas. Difficult to solve problems tend to be shelved. Secondly, lobby and interest groups still enjoy a particularly high level of consolidated power and informal political influence. And which lobby and interest groups do I mean? I mean the lobby groups of oil, coal, energy-intensive or automobile industries, for example. And associations from the economic sector have a far greater conflict handling capacities than associations in socio-ecological cross-sectional areas representing general and public interest. So in other words, the non-governmental organizations have a far lower capacity to bring in their interests in the political discussions. Thirdly, we realize horizontal and vertical policy integration and fragmentation into different levels. For example, in the case of Germany, we find a federal state and individual states, or in the case of the European Union, we find the nation states and the EU. These complex state models result in horizontal and vertical barriers. We recognize a lack of coherence and coordination of these constitutions and institutions. Fourthly, perceived participation deficit on the part of the citizens is another significant barrier to transformation implementation. The result is a lack of acceptance. What is therefore missing is appropriate consolidation and representation on a parliamentary level and other options for productively realizing citizen commitment. Now I like to explain which legal prerequisites are needed for a proactive state. We have to differentiate 4 areas: the constitutional level, the substantive law, the procedural law, and institutions, or in other words, institutional requirements. At the constitutional level, the state's responsibility for climate policy can be highlighted and strengthened by an explicit reference to climate protection in the Constitution. In the case of Germany, for example, the explicit inclusion of climate protection in Article 20a of the German Constitution would emphasize its outstanding importance and the commitment on the part of the state. A lot of lawyers now would argument, well, we have already the climate protection stipulated in our Constitution, not explicit, but implicit. That is right. But the outstanding importance of climate protection would be underlined if we write it down in our Constitution in an explicit way. A national climate protection objective would oblige the state and its institutions to pursue an active and appropriate climate protection policy. The legislator and the executive institutions of a proactive state are then initially and primarily required to effectively implement the setting of a national objective. The requisite decision-making process must take climate protection into account, and executive and judiciary institutions fulfill their constitutional responsibility for environmental protection by interpreting the existing regulations created by the legislative power as a concretization of the national objective in a climate-friendly way. They thereby use their scope of discretion and scope for judgment evaluation to implement low-carbon solutions. Now I will come to the substantive level, and I mean with this expression substantive level, the legal level, so all the regulations above the Constitution which stipulates climate protection, for example. At the substantive level, the national objective of climate protection should be concretized in the form of climate protection legislation. The core element of such a climate protection law is the establishment of legally binding mitigation targets. In the case of Germany, there is a binding commitment to the complete decarbonization of Germany's energy system by 2050, equaling a 100% reduction of CO2 emissions from fossil energy sources should be included. So perhaps to define this or to concretize this a little bit, we now do not have a binding regulation which stipulates this target of a fossil fuel-free energy system by 2050. At the moment, we have a political will to do so, but not a binding target. As such, a climate protection law only contains the general obligation of all government bodies to implement climate protection measures. Further reaching legal regulations are necessary to specify concrete measures for achieving the respective interim targets. Beyond these, targets should also be set for the share of renewable energies in primary energy consumption reduction, and energy efficiency increase rates. Furthermore, the climate protection law should include an obligation to implement low-carbon solutions. Current discussions have concentrated primarily on transformation instruments and barriers in Western industrialized societies and democracies. But for a global transformation to succeed, the newly industrializing countries in particular must become actors in the low-carbon transition as well. I will now briefly outline the transformation developments in China, Brazil, and in India, and I will illustrate the very different basic patterns of socio-economic and change in typical newly industrializing countries. Firstly, I will discuss China. Economic growth and energy demand in China continue to rise strongly despite the worldwide economic crisis of recent years. Due to the rapidly increasing energy demand, the government is also investing heavily in expansion of nuclear energy and renewable energies. And it is also investing in coal energy plants. High investment dynamics and the investment structure show that national and international investors are willing to realize long-term projects in China. Members of the Chinese government and economy, for instance, believe that China has a much better chance of making the technological change towards a climate-friendly future and to make it faster than Western industrialized countries. It could therefore unlock associated competitive advantages for itself. The potential pioneering role of China in the area of green development could be central to enhancing the emerging superpower's reputation abroad. China is currently under criticism for issues regarding democracy and human rights. You know this. But there are certain elements which could constrict the transformation in China. Social advancement is at the very top of the personal agenda for many Chinese people. So a green transformation could be perceived as slowing economic progress. In addition, the fragile acceptance and the legitimization of the Chinese government is the Achilles heel of Chinese development. The Chinese government suppressed any news in the media on the democratic movements in North Africa and the seriousness of the nuclear accident in Fukushima. That proves its incapability of holding public discussions on the future in sensitive areas like environment or climate protection. Moreover, the Chinese government is presently already confronted with problems concerning the implementation of central state decisions in the regions and local communities. Now I will shortly discuss Brazil. In Brazil, the current situation is completely different. It enjoys favorable political conditions for a post-fossil transition. In Brazil, we recognize democracy, institutional capacities, and a high government legitimization. Besides, it has excellent natural geographical conditions for the use of renewable energies, particularly hydropower and ethanol. The international community shows significant willingness to support Brazil in protecting the Amazon rainforest, and 70% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to deforestation. Nevertheless, even in Brazil, obstacles for a transformation exist. Brazilian policymakers, its economy and its society are currently still guided predominantly by the industrial era's established modernization paradigms. The discourse of climate compatibility is also less pronounced than in China. In addition, there are large oil deposits of Brazil's coastal areas, triggering economic desires and hopes of increasing Brazil's role in the global economy. Now I will come to India. In India just recently, there is a slide. In India just recently, the government announced energy efficiency programs and placed the issue of controlling emission increases on the political agenda. But the central issue of political debate in India in the foreseeable future is increasing economic performance and reducing the still high level of poverty. It is therefore unlikely that India will provide any strong impulses for a low-carbon transformation of the global economy. However, if relevant national economies can demonstrate that low-carbon development pathways, competitiveness and poverty reduction can be combined, the conditions for learning from the experience would be particularly favorable in India. Despite the high economic growth of the past 2 decades, India's per capita CO2 emissions from fossil sources were only 1.3 tons in 2007, which is considerably lower than in China or Brazil. The fossil past dependencies impeding the transformation in the OECD countries and in China are therefore significantly lower. In contrast to China, India is still has a chance of steering its modernization process without taking the fossil detour and to rely on a low-carbon development path early on the process. To sum up, the required transformation process towards a low-carbon society represents a huge political challenge. Even though the individual political instruments for the systematic transformation of economy and society are known, and some have been tried and tested, in this respect, the German Advisory Council on Global Change mainly views CO2 pricing as a core and central element of a transformation policy. However, political, institutional, and economic past dependencies, interest structures, and veto players impede the transition towards sustainability-focused policymaking. The Council concludes that the key to the transformation lies in a new form of statehood. The central element is a proactive state and enabling state which actively sets priorities whilst also offering its citizens increased opportunities for participation and affords the economy choices with regard to acting with sustainability in mind. Attached, you will find a couple of exercises for your self-study, and they will deal with the aforementioned topics and help you to test your knowledge and to prepare for the examen. And finally, I give you some references for further reading. Thank you very much.